are going to cause trouble with us, with the United States. Where does our sovereignty then come into play here? That we get to decide which countries we'd like to align with, and we won't be dictated to by other nations, even the United States.
Now, when you align yourself with countries that don't uphold human rights, you are not only acting in worse interests, but you are also demonstrating that you have no respect for your own constitution.
The United States is very close to Israel. Israel has been taken to the ICJ. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed and continue to be massacred. That's also not of moral ground either.
If you are going to say you uphold your constitution and you are non-aligned, then don't also be favoritist. Don't also take spaces where ultimately you say to yourself, I will host the Iranian ambassador, knowing fully well that in that instance, comparatively, on a trade balance, on our relations with Iran and where it sits in the world, we have made in our consequences and will face the consequences. So South Africa must be consistent in its approach for the interests that it has stated up front. But if you then say you are no longer aligned and you pick one direction, then don't be surprised when you have to pick up consequences.
Guys, I love this video so much. You know, this is an intellectual. Whenever I listen to boss Musi Maimane, I just hear a man that's full of wisdom, and you know, I love the way he articulates the complexity of South Africa's positionality in the global world affairs and his analysis of what's really going on. So I think this video, anyway, this is a really powerful interview. I really appreciate and admonish you guys to watch till the end, because he really speaks about certain things that all South Africans and all lovers of South Africa need to know and understand about the future, at least for the next 4 years, which we're going to be dealing or having to deal with Donald Trump in power, and even after that. That's really important for South Africa today. So I think this video is actually, in a way, my interpretation of his response from Ibrahim Rasool's speech after coming back from the United States. We know that Ibrahim Rasool, former ambassador of South Africa, was actually kind of like given a persona non grata status and was asked to leave the United States in 72 hours. I think he arrived yesterday or probably 2 days ago, and this was the speech he had to give. I think this is before the report which President Ramaphosa has asked him to write to explain all of that whole thing that went on in the US. So let's begin this video with a short excerpt from Ibrahim Rasool, a speech he had. I think this is probably still at the airport or a rally that welcomed him. So we hear and understand how he thinks that he represented South Africa and why he thinks probably the justifications for him being given a persona non grata status might not have been fair as a South African ambassador. Let's quickly listen and we're back to Musi Maimane's speech.
We tried the conventional diplomacy and said that we must pretend that there is no merit in the idea, or that there's merit in the idea of land confiscations. We could not ignore that. And so we had to go to what is the diplomacy of ubuntu, the diplomacy of mutual interdependence, that I am because you are. The diplomacy of ubuntu is not the art of lying for your country.
That's true.
It is the art of speaking the truth, but gently. The diplomacy of ubuntu is not flattering your host, and the diplomacy of ubuntu is not denying what is wrong. The diplomacy of ubuntu is intellectual engagement, and it is persuasion of your host about a better way. The diplomacy of ubuntu is not sacrificing your values, but it is about universalizing your values. The diplomacy of ubuntu is not about forfeiting your interests and not having interests with another country, but it is about pursuing your interest but keeping your dignity. That's what the diplomacy of ubuntu is about, and that's what I thought was the way forward in this very difficult and challenging situation of our relationship with the United States. We were in the airport in Doha, Rashida and I, and someone came up to us, saw the badge I was wearing, knew immediately that I was the ambassador who was declared a persona non grata. And she said, "Thank you very much." And I said, "I'm not sure about how we are going home." And she said, "There's only one way to go home, and that is with dignity. Because if you don't stand up, who will stand up?" And she was Lebanese. She said, "A bully never needs a good reason to act against you. A bully will even do it because your hair is too short." And so I want to say that South Africa is not a military superpower. South Africa is not an economic superpower. But South Africa has the ability again to become a moral superpower, to stand up against chauvinism, to stand up against populism, and to say that what our people died for in Sharpeville on the 21st of March, that's what we stand for. Foremost amongst that is justice. Foremost amongst that is inclusion. Foremost amongst that is truth. A declaration of persona non grata is meant to humiliate you. But when you return to a crowd like this and with warmth and a sense of ubuntu like this, then I will wear my persona non grata as a badge of dignity, a badge of our values, and a badge that we have done the right thing. Thank you very much. Amandla.
Yeah, guys, so as you can see, this is really important to understand that the ambassador of South Africa, this is his perspective to how South Africa should relate, or probably ought to have related to the United States. And you know, when an ambassador speaks, this ambassador is an embodiment of the entire nation, an embodiment of the nation of South Africa itself. So this is actually the philosophy he had in his diplomatic, relationship with countries, the philosophy of ubuntu and all of that. But one struggle a lot of people have been asking is probably these things he speaks about, if this was a representation of the multiplicity and multi-diversity, or the diversity anyway of South Africa and South Africans in their multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic diversity, as we usually say, black, white, colored, and Indians. You see, so I don't know if this his perspective to relating with the United States was a collective notion of all South Africans, or probably just a portion. But Maimane here is now breaking the whole complexity with South Africa-US relations and really giving some smart insights on how the fact that if South Africa decides or chooses or asserts that it is a non-aligned state, then it should be consistent in its non-alignment, so to speak, with some states. But if it decides to violate that, then it shouldn't be surprised with the consequences that come. I think some of the consequences are what has been hitting South Africa since the inception of Donald Trump. And let's quickly listen to Maimane break down with logic. Really brilliant speech, bro. I watched this over and over again because I couldn't just believe the amount of intelligence in this guy, Maimane. Well, let's quickly listen to how he breaks down Ibrahim Rasool. Let's listen to how he breaks down SC's relationship with Iran and the United States, and share your thoughts, guys, in the comments.
Yeah, because we've also seen that this approach that the Trump administration has, it's not necessarily just for South Africa. This has been across the board, even for allies such as Canada as well, in the tariff wars that we're seeing playing out. Now, there's been mixed reaction about, of course, the comments that were made by our former ambassador. When it also comes to alignment as well, you said there's red flags there where South Africa has aligned itself with nations that are going to cause trouble with us, with the United States. Where does our sovereignty then come into play here? That we get to decide which countries we'd like to align with, and we won't be dictated to by other nations, even the United States.
The first is that your constitution speaks quite strongly about when you are making foreign policy choices, because foreign policy choices are hard to make unless you've got guiding principles. And one of the key guiding principles is human rights and trade. Now, when you align yourself with countries that don't uphold human rights, you are not only acting in worse interests, but you are also demonstrating that you have no respect for your own constitution. Secondly, if indeed the dictum remains true that you then deal with foreign policy on the basis of trade, which is the second part, then you think hard about who your biggest trading partners are, and it's not pitting one against the other. There's this sort of underlying theme that sometimes sits within certain people who think to be progressive is to be anti-West, or an anti-Western approach is progressive. And I'm not always sure that aligns with our trade interests, given the fact that in our top 3 trading partners, you've got the EU countries, you've got the US, of course you've got China, but you've also got the UK in and of itself. Therefore, for us, we've got to think through how we enhance those trading, because at the end of the day, this is not about political preferences. It's not what Mr. Rasool's opinion is. It has to do with the 100,000 South Africans that will lose their jobs one way or another, or it has to do with our own interests in the long term. Lastly, I do think on the PEPFAR issue, if you want to talk sovereignty, South Africa and Africa, we learned this lesson during COVID. We needed to create a pharmacology institution here in South Africa so that we can patent our own vaccines, so that we're not dependent on US patents. We can create a fund that deals with HIV funding, because a virus doesn't remain located in one jurisdiction. It moves as people move. And certainly for SADC, we need a fund like that so that we can capacitate the other countries that sit within us and for our own self. So an Africa fund here is necessary so that we're not dealing with PEPFAR. And then I would argue this one last point, and this is the crucial issue here. South Africa needs a growth strategy, a trade strategy, and laws that endorse that, so that we can say it is on our terms that we either choose to align with you or not. And if we've got a growth strategy that's dependent on rail, that's dependent on investment in infrastructure, then you suddenly say to yourself, we will partner with people that need those, and we'll focus on that as a foreign policy dictum.
When it comes to aligning with countries of, questionable human rights, or countries that align themselves with countries that have questionable human rights, the United States is very close to Israel. Israel has been taken to the ICJ. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed and continue to be massacred. That's also not of moral ground either. So we can't take the lead, per se, from a country that also associates itself with another country that has human rights violations. When we look at Russia, for instance, our relationship with Russia of being non-aligned or just on the fence has been questioned as well. But Trump clearly has a relationship with Putin now. So wouldn't it fluctuate if we had to listen to the music or the beat of the United States?
Well, no one, if you are going to make foreign policy choices, for me, again, I want to harp on their own consistencies. And fair enough, I'm not going to endorse the US views on many positions they've taken all over the world. But if you are going to say you uphold your constitution and you are non-aligned, then don't also be favoritist. Don't also take spaces where ultimately you say to yourself, I will host the Iranian ambassador, knowing fully well that in that instance, comparatively, on a trade balance, on our relations with Iran and where it sits in the world, we have made our consequences and we'll face the consequences. So again, I think we await the case on the ICJ. South Africa has got a lot of work to do with Israel in and of itself. And I think India gives us a hint here. What India did is that India have traded with both Russia and the Ukraine to demonstrate their non-aligned position. What India have done, even in the Israel-Palestine issue, despite the conflict that is going on there, and all of us all over the world need to see an end to that conflict, need to see justice take place. But we recognize the fact that if there's a global positioning of what a two-state solution looks like, we trade with both Israel and we do a lot of work with Palestinians. Therefore, South Africa must be consistent in its approach for the interests that it has stated up front. But if you then say you are no longer aligned and you pick one direction, then don't be surprised when you have to pick up consequences one way or another, good or bad, depending on the route you take. But all I'm asking is that your pronouncements, your actions, your interests must be articulated on growth and to achieve what nation you want to see in the long run.
Finally, our former ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, is on his way back to South Africa. It was yesterday on Human Rights Day where the DA's Helen Zille was recommending or suggesting someone like Tony Leon to take up that space. There's also been backlash and mixed reaction to that too. Yeah. Firstly, what's your reaction to the suggestion of Tony Leon? And secondly, as Build One South Africa, who would you recommend as the new ambassador? I
think more than anything, and this is where I've got to be specific, you've got to pick someone rather than an individual, and because it gets a bit tricky to pick individuals, but I would rather look at someone who potentially is a person of faith, because we can't take away the conversations around faith in the US. It has to be someone who understands trade and bilateral relations. It has to be someone with a strong history of a defense for human rights. And ultimately, it has to be someone who will recognize the fact that what part of the dilemma, and having been to Washington myself historically on different trips, recognition about the relations between that Africa Senate committee, that person needs to be able to represent the continent at large, equally so. So let's find a person that does that. I'm not convinced Tony Leon would meet that criteria if you put it forward. And as Build One South Africa, we need someone who will also be someone who wants to build One South Africa, who is multiracial in representation, given the fact that the AfriForums and all of them, when they arrive, certainly misrepresent some of what goes on in the country, but sow seeds of division within our own country. Therefore, I think whoever becomes the US ambassador needs to be someone who is quite non-racial in approach, constitutionalist, and ultimately is representing a wider spectrum of South Africans. And so I wouldn't just pick a cadre from a political party of any kind. I would really look at someone who is erudite, who is fresh, who will bring fresh objectives to a fairly complicated, ever-changing United States with stances that we don't always agree on, but certainly someone who will say, what is the South African interest I need to uphold here?
Maimane, thank you so much for your time.